A desperate plan. The alert klaxons had been wailing for so long that Commander Rook Harrison had almost forgotten what silence felt like. He stood at the observation deck of Vega Colony, watching the last civilian transport disappear into the swirling purple nebula that had once seemed so beautiful. Now it just reminded him of spreading poison. 17 hours until Kryvak's fleet arrival. The AI announced overhead, its voice eerily calm. Rook ran his fingers through his graying hair, the scars on his knuckles catching the stark emergency lighting. 20,000 colonists still waited for evacuation below, and they had transport capacity for barely a third of that number. Commander Harrison to Engineering Bay 7, his comm crackled. Urgent. He recognized the distinctive harmonic undertones of Zentai's voice. The Meridian engineer had been working nonstop for 3 days, trying to find solutions that didn't exist. Rook had told her to rest 12 hours ago, but he knew she wouldn't. Meridians could go 5 days without sleep, and Zentai would use every minute of that. The trek to Engineering Bay 7 took him through corridors packed with frightened colonists. Children clutched stuffed animals while parents tried to maintain brave faces. Rook nodded to them as he passed, maintaining the stoic expression expected of a commander, even as his stomach churned with the knowledge that most of them wouldn't make it out. The Kryvaks hadn't even bothered to send demands. Their fleet had appeared at the edge of the system 6 days ago, and their reputation preceded them. They were planet killers, systematic exterminators who believed their gods had granted them sole right to the galaxy. Negotiation wasn't in their vocabulary. Engineering Bay 7 was supposed to be a maintenance facility. Now it looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. Tools and components littered every surface, and holographic calculations spiraled through the air in dizzying patterns. In the center stood Zentai, her crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the emergency lights like a prism. She was staring at something that made Rook's blood run cold. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is," he said, approaching the massive cylinder suspended in the center of the room. "Experimental fusion warhead," Zentai confirmed, her head crystals tinkling as she turned to face him. "Recovered from military storage Block C rated at 50 megatons. And before you cite regulations, I've already broken 17 of them just by accessing it." Rook circled the weapon slowly. "I'm more concerned about the other 40,000 regulations we break by doing whatever you're thinking." "Who said I was thinking anything?" Zentai's crystal fragments shifted in what Rook had learned was her species' equivalent of a smile. "I merely thought you should know about this extremely powerful explosive device that happens to be in our possession. One that hypothetically could be modified into a makeshift propulsion system capable of reaching velocities that would make our fastest ships look like they're standing still." Rook stopped circling and stared at her. "You want to ride a nuclear bomb into the Kryvak's fleet. Fusion, not nuclear. Much cleaner. And technically, we'd be riding the directed plasma stream from a series of carefully controlled fusion detonations." She projected a diagram into the air between them. "The math works. I've run it 17,000 times. The math working doesn't mean we'd survive," Rook said, but he was already studying the calculations. Something in his chest tightened as he realized she was right. The numbers didn't lie. "We won't survive anyway," Zentai said quietly. "The Kryvaks never leave survivors. But this," she gestured at the warhead, "this gives us a chance to do more than die. We could strike their command ship directly, disable their fleet coordination, give our people time to evacuate." Rook closed his eyes, seeing again the faces of the colonists in the corridors. He thought of his oath to protect them, of all the regulations and safety protocols that were supposed to matter. Then he thought of the Kryvaks, of worlds burned to ash in their wake. "How long would it take to modify?" he asked. 8 hours for the conversion. Another 6 for testing and calibration. We'd launch with a 3-hour window before their fleet arrives. Zentai's crystals chimed with excitement. "But we'd need help. Engineer Park from propulsion, Dr. Caffrey from weapons, and someone who can pilot something that was never meant to fly." "I know a pilot," Rook said, thinking of Lieutenant Jasmine Wade, whose simulator scores were legendary. But we'll need to keep this quiet. If Colonial Administration gets wind of it, they'd shut us down and court-martial everyone involved. Zentai finished. Assuming the Kryvax left enough of us to court-martial, Rook walked to the nearest terminal and entered his command codes, authorizing access to the restricted materials they'd need. Get your team together. I'll handle administration and find our pilot. We launch in 14 hours. As he turned to leave, Zentai called after him. Commander, the survival probability is less than 8%. Rook looked back at her, allowing himself a grim smile. Better odds than we have right now. He strode out of Engineering Bay 7 with purpose, his mind already racing through the list of regulations they were about to shatter. Sometimes survival meant breaking all the rules, and sometimes salvation came in the form of a crazy plan and a modified weapon of mass destruction. The klaxons continued their mournful wail overhead, but now they seemed less like a dirge and more like a countdown. 14 hours to build the impossible. 14 hours to give humanity a fighting chance. The game was on. Engineering the impossible. Lieutenant Jasmine Wade's hands moved across the simulator controls with practiced precision, her dark eyes focused on the holographic readouts swimming before her. The makeshift control system they'd cobbled together looked more like an abstract art installation than a pilot's console. Run it again, she said, not bothering to look at the failed simulation statistics floating in red beside her. It was her 27th attempt in 2 hours. The structural integrity. Engineer Park started to say, "Run it again." Behind them, Commander Rook Harrison watched as the simulation played out once more. The modified warhead, which they'd started calling the Firefly, blazed across virtual space like a miniature sun. This time, Wade managed to compensate for the plasma oscillation that had torn apart their previous attempts, but at the cost of burning through their fuel reserves too quickly. The simulation ended with another failure notification. "The problem isn't your piloting," Zentai said, her crystalline form casting prismatic patterns across the engineering bay's walls. "It's the containment field. We're losing too much energy through the secondary vents." Dr. Caffrey, who hadn't slept in 36 hours, looked up from her workstation. Her fingers were stained with conductive gel, and her hijab was slightly askew. "If we reinforce the magnetic bottling with a second layer of containment, we'll add too much mass. The thrust-to-weight ratio will." "What if we don't contain it?" Wade interrupted, finally turning from the simulator. "What if we let it leak?" The room fell silent. Even the distant klaxons seemed to quiet for a moment. "Elaborate," Zentai said, her crystals tinkling with interest. Wade stood and walked to the actual Firefly, which hung suspended in its maintenance cradle like a massive silver torpedo. "We're trying to make it stable. But what if stability is our enemy? What if we treat the plasma leakage like a secondary propulsion system?" Park's eyes widened. "You want to surf the breakaway particles?" "Exactly." Wade's fingers traced the vessel's hull. The leaked plasma would create a wake. With the right shielding configuration, we could ride it like a wave. It would multiply our effective thrust without requiring additional fuel. Rook stepped forward. "And the radiation would kill us slightly slower than the Kryvax will," Chatri said, but her fingers were already flying across her tablet, running new calculations. "Though if we reconfigure the inner shielding to focus solely on the pilot compartment." 10 hours until fleet arrival, the AI announced overhead, its timing impeccable. Rook felt the weight of command pressing down on him. They'd managed to keep their operation secret from Colonial Administration so far, but their window was closing. Below them, the remaining evacuation ships were loading as many colonists as they could safely carry, and some they couldn't. Every minute they spent perfecting their desperate plan was a minute they weren't helping with the evacuation. "Do it," he ordered. "Make the modifications, but we launch in 8 hours, ready or not." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of welding sparks, quantum calculations, and desperate innovation. They cannibalized parts from 3 different ships, including a prototype shield generator that technically didn't exist according to official records. Zentai's crystalline hands moved with impossible precision as she rewired systems that were never meant to work together. The first full power test nearly vaporized Engineering Bay 7. The second cracked 3 support beams and set off every radiation alarm in the sector. The third worked, sort of. 62% thrust capacity, Park reported, reading from a smoking diagnostic panel. Plasma containment at acceptable levels, though I use that term loosely. Shield integrity holding at 87%. It'll have to do, Rook said, watching as damage control teams sprayed fire-suppressing foam around the test chamber. We're out of time for refinements. Wade was already climbing into the pilot's compartment, running through pre-launch checks. The interior was cramped, barely large enough for 2 people, most of the space taken up by the jury-rigged control systems and radiation shielding. "Commander," Zentai said quietly, pulling Rook aside. "There's something else you should know. The calculations I showed you earlier. I simplified them." Rook felt his stomach tighten. Simplified how? The 8% survival probability. That was optimistic. With these modifications, it's closer to 3%. And that's assuming everything works perfectly. Before Rook could respond, a new alarm joined the chorus overhead. This one had a different tone, one that made everyone in the bay freeze. "Security teams en route to Engineering Bay 7, the AI announced, by order of Colonial Administration. "They know," Park whispered. Rook's mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as they came. They couldn't fight their way out. The security teams would be armed and numerous. They couldn't talk their way out. What they were doing violated too many regulations to count. They couldn't. "How long until the Firefly is launch-ready?" he asked. 20 minutes for minimum functionality," Chatri answered. "But Commander, without the final calibrations." "You have 5 minutes." Rook drew his command pistol and walked to the bay's main entrance. "I'll buy you what time I can. Wade, get that thing started. Everyone else, finish what you can, and then get clear." "Commander," Zentai started to protest. "That's an order." He punched in the door's lockdown code. 5 minutes. Make them count. As the security team's boots thundered down the corridor outside, Rook checked his pistol's charge and took up position beside the door. Behind him, his team worked with desperate speed, their earlier precision replaced by necessary haste. The Firefly's engines began to hum, a sound unlike anything human technology had produced before. It was the sound of rules being broken, of physics being bent, of desperation being transformed into hope. It was the sound of their last chance, and Rook intended to make sure they got to take it. The point of no return. The security team's cutting torch was halfway through the bay door when the Firefly's engines reached full power. The makeshift launch cradle groaned under the strain, metal supports bending like plastic in a furnace. "Now or never," Wade shouted from the pilot's compartment, her voice barely audible over the rising whine of the fusion drive. Rook fired one last warning shot at the door, more to buy seconds than to actually deter anyone, then sprinted toward the Firefly. Zentai's crystalline form flashed in the strobing emergency lights as she made final adjustments to the plasma containment field. "The field won't hold more than 6 hours," she said, her harmonic voice tight with concern. "After that, the radiation. We'll all be dead or heroes by then." Rook cut her off, climbing into the co-pilot's seat beside Wade. "Clear the bay." The engineering team scattered toward the radiation shelters. As they ran, Rook caught a glimpse of Dr. Chatri making a crude gesture at the security teams, still trying to breach the door. Even in this moment of crisis, it almost made him smile. "Colonial Administration override in progress," the AI announced. "Bay doors will open in 30 seconds. "They're trying to space us," Wade realized, her hands dancing across the controls. "Better than letting security in, I suppose. Can we survive an emergency launch?" We're about to find out. The bay doors began to slide open overhead, revealing the star-studded blackness of space. Warning klaxons screamed about imminent decompression. The security team's cutting torch went dark as emergency protocols kicked in. Wade's fingers found the launch sequence initiator. Hold on to something, Commander. What exactly am I supposed to hold on to in this? The Firefly's first fusion pulse hit like a hammer blow from God. Rook's vision blurred as acceleration crushed him into his seat. The launch cradle disintegrated behind them, vaporized by the plasma wake. They shot through the opening bay doors with meters to spare, the Firefly's makeshift hull screaming as it scraped against steel. Then they were in space, riding a controlled nuclear firestorm. Status. Rook managed to gasp once the initial acceleration eased enough for him to breathe. Shields holding at 70%, Wade reported, making microscopic adjustments to their course. Plasma containment stable. Hull integrity. She paused. Well, we still have a hull, so I'm counting that as a win. Rook activated the rear viewers. Vega Colony grew smaller behind them, its massive form wrapped in the purple tendrils of the surrounding nebula. Evacuation ships continued to launch from other bays, looking like silver tears against the darkness. His comm crackled. Commander, it was Zentai. We're receiving new data from the long-range sensors. You need to see this. Data streamed across their display. At first, Rook thought the readings must be wrong. Then his blood ran cold. Wade, he said quietly, are you seeing this? Yes, her voice was equally soft. The Krivax fleet. They're not just carrying weapons. The sensor data painted a horrifying picture. The approaching alien ships weren't just warships. They were terraforming vessels. Massive machines designed to remake worlds. They're not here to destroy the colony, Rook realized. They're here to transform it, to make it suitable for their own kind, with all our people still on it. Converting matter at the atomic level, Wade added, studying the readouts. Everyone left behind would be reconfigured. Their very atoms repurposed. The implications hit Rook like a physical blow. A quick death from conventional weapons would have been mercy compared to having your entire being slowly transformed into something alien. His comm crackled again. This time, it was Dr. Katri. Commander, if these readings are correct, the Krivax ships will be generating massive transformation fields. Their shields have to be weaker to allow the fields to operate. A weakness, Wade said, her eyes lighting up. We can work with that. Rook studied their tactical display. The Firefly's fusion drive was pushing them faster than any human ship had ever traveled, leaving a trail of plasma fire across the void. But the Krivax fleet was still hours away from the colony. How many more fusion pulses can we manage? He asked. Wade checked their fuel readings. Maybe 4, 5 at most. Enough to reach them, but not enough to get back. Rook nodded. Was there ever really a chance of that? A new alert flashed across their screens. Colonial administration had managed to get a message drone through their plasma wake. Commander Harrison. Admiral Chen's voice filled their cramped compartment. Return to base immediately. That is a direct order. Whatever you're planning. Rook shut off the comm. Lieutenant Wade, plot a direct course to the Krivax command ship. Wade's hands were already moving across the controls. Course plotted. But sir, at these speeds, even a microscopic calculation error means death. Better than watching our people be transformed into raw materials for an alien world. Rook strapped himself in tighter. Besides, I always wanted to be a shooting star. Wade smiled grimly and engaged the next fusion pulse. The Firefly leaped forward like a spear thrown by a titan, its plasma wake blazing across the stars. Behind them, Vega Colony continued its desperate evacuation. Before them, the Krivax fleet waited, unaware that humanity had decided to change the rules of engagement. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that was designed to be a weapon at all. It's the one that was made by people with nothing left to lose. Riding the lightning. Space turned into a blur of distorted light as the Firefly screamed through the void, riding its own wave of nuclear fire. Inside the cramped cockpit, warning indicators flashed across every surface like an angry constellation. Plasma containment at 40%, Wade reported, her voice steady despite the gravitational forces crushing them into their seats. Hull temperature approaching critical levels. Rook tried to nod, but the G-forces made even that simple movement difficult. How long until we reach the Kryvax fleet? 17 minutes at current velocity, assuming we don't vaporize first. The tactical display showed the Kryvax ships spread out in a perfect geometric formation. 12 massive terraforming vessels arranged around their command ship like petals around a metal flower, each one capable of rewriting matter at the atomic level, of transforming human bodies into alien building materials. Wade's hands danced across the controls, making infinitesimal adjustments to their course. They're starting to react to our approach. Energy readings spiking across their fleet. Can they intercept us? At these speeds, Wade allowed herself a grim smile. They can try. The first Kryvax defensive shots came as streams of coherent energy, lighting up space like silver threads. At normal speeds, they would have been impossible to dodge. But the Firefly was riding a controlled nuclear explosion, moving faster than human ships were ever meant to travel. Wade rolled their vessel through the barrage, using the plasma wake itself as a shield. Where the energy beams struck the wake, they created brilliant explosions that looked like miniature supernovas. 14 minutes to intercept, she called out. They're adapting their firing patterns. The next volley came from multiple directions at once, trying to box them in. Wade responded by triggering their second-to-last fusion pulse early. The Firefly lurched forward with such force that Rook felt his consciousness starting to fade. Sorry about that, Wade said, though her focus never wavered from their approach vector. Had to thread the needle. Through blurred vision, Rook watched the tactical display. The Kryvax ships were beginning to break their perfect formation, moving to create a more comprehensive defensive screen. But in doing so, they revealed something unexpected. Lieutenant, he managed to gasp. Are you seeing the energy fluctuations in their shields? Wade nodded, her eyes lighting up with understanding. The transformation fields, they're having to constantly adjust their shield harmonics to maintain them. Creates a rhythm, a pattern. Can you time our approach to match their shield fluctuations? Maybe. Her fingers flew across the controls, programming new parameters into their final fusion pulse. But we have to hit them at exactly the right moment, a fraction of a second off. And we become a very expensive firework, Rook finished. Do it. The Kryvax command ship grew larger in their forward viewport, its crystalline surface reflecting the light of distant stars. It was beautiful in its alien way, like a cathedral built by geometrically obsessed gods. 8 minutes to intercept, Wade announced. They're charging something big. Energy readings off the scale. The space ahead of them began to distort as the Kryvax deployed their primary weapon. Reality itself seemed to bend and twist, creating a barrier of warped spacetime. They're trying to fold space, Rook realized. Create a knot we can't navigate through. Wade's response was to push their engines even harder. Warning klaxons screamed as the Firefly's makeshift systems were stressed beyond their limits. Physics is just a suggestion anyway, right? The vessel shuddered as they hit the edge of the spatial distortion. Metal groaned. Systems flickered. For a moment, Rook felt his body being stretched in impossible directions as space itself tried to redirect their course. Then they were through, trailing fragments of their outer hull behind them like a comet's tail. 3 minutes, Wade said through gritted teeth. Plasma containment failing. Hull integrity at 20%. But their shields are starting to show the pattern. I can see it now, like waves on an ocean. Rook looked at their fuel gauge. 1 fusion pulse left. 1 chance to get this right. Lieutenant Wade, he said formally, it's been an honor. She spared him a quick glance and a smile. Honor's been mine. "Commander, now let's show these aliens why you don't mess with human colonies." The Krivak's command ship filled their entire view now. Its surface was alive with energy as it prepared to fire its main weapons. Their sensors screamed warnings about multiple targeting locks, about failing systems, about imminent structural collapse. Wade's hands moved across the controls one final time, programming the precise moment for their last fusion pulse. Everything would have to be perfect. Their speed, their angle, the timing of the Krivak's shield fluctuations. "Impact in 30 seconds, she announced. "Ready to initiate final pulse on your command." Rook took one last look at the tactical display, at the colony they were leaving behind, at the stars that had brought humanity this far. Then he straightened in his seat, ignoring the pain of acceleration and the warnings of certain death. "Lieutenant Wade," he said clearly, "light it up." The Firefly's final fusion pulse ignited, and they rode their last nuclear heartbeat toward destiny. A new dawn. Time seemed to slow in the final seconds before impact. The Firefly's last fusion pulse transformed their vessel into pure energy, a human-made meteor burning brighter than any star in the system. Warning systems no longer screamed. They had all melted or shorted out. There was only the roar of their makeshift drive, and the silent prayer that Wade's calculations were correct. Through the disintegrating viewport, Rook watched the Krivak's command ship's shield ripple with geometric patterns, like waves on an alien ocean, just as Wade had said. Their timing would have to be perfect. 5 seconds, Wade called out, her voice steady even as their vessel began to break apart around them. 4, 3. The Krivak's shields fluctuated exactly as predicted, creating a millisecond-long weakness in their defense pattern. It was barely enough time for an energy beam to penetrate, let alone a ship. But the Firefly wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a directed fusion reaction traveling at impossible speeds, guided by human determination and desperation. 2, 1. They hit the shield at the exact moment of fluctuation. For a split second, nothing happened. Then reality itself seemed to tear open. The Firefly's fusion core, no longer contained by its failing systems, released all its energy at once. The blast pierced through the weakened shield like a needle through fabric, carrying with it the remains of their vessel and its 2-person crew. Inside the Krivak's command ship, automated systems registered the breach too late. The uncontrolled fusion reaction met the ship's transformation field generators, creating a cascade effect that no engineer, human or Krivak's, had ever predicted. The resulting explosion was visible from 3 systems away. The Krivak's command ship didn't just explode, it imploded, collapsed, and then erupted in a burst of energy that rippled through space-time itself. The transformation fields meant to remake human worlds turned inward, twisting their own technology into unrecognizable forms. The effect spread through their perfectly geometrical formation like a stone breaking a mirror. Ship after ship lost control of their transformation fields, their own technology becoming their undoing. In the void where the Firefly had been, something impossible happened. The fusion reaction, instead of simply destroying everything in its path, interacted with the Krivak's transformation fields in a way that defied conventional physics. For a brief moment, energy became matter, matter became energy, and the barrier between the two blurred. When rescue ships finally arrived from Vega Colony hours later, they found the Krivak's fleet in ruins. 11 of the 12 terraforming vessels were twisted wrecks, their transformation fields permanently disrupted. The command ship was simply gone, along with any trace of the Firefly. But they also found something else, an emergency pod, its design a bizarre hybrid of human and Krivak's technology, created in that moment when the laws of physics took a brief vacation. Inside, unconscious but alive, were Commander Rook Harrison and Lieutenant Jasmine Wade. The pod's hull was crystalline, like Zentai's exoskeleton. Its life support systems somehow incorporated both human and Krivak's engineering principles in ways that would keep scientists puzzled for decades. It was as if the universe itself had decided to reward their courage with a miracle born of the very forces they had unleashed. 3 days later, in the Vega Colony Medical Bay, Wade opened her eyes to find Zentai standing by her bed, crystalline form refracting the soft medical lights. "Did we?" Wade's voice was hoarse. "Did it work?" "The Kryvax fleet is destroyed," Zentai confirmed. "More than that. The transformation field backfire corrupted their entire tactical database. They've lost the coordinates to dozens of planned targets. Humanity has gained decades to prepare for their next encounter." "And the colony?" "Safe. As are you and the commander, though the doctors are still trying to understand exactly how. The pod you were found in, it shouldn't be possible. It's already revolutionizing our understanding of matter-energy conversion." Wade closed her eyes, remembering the moment of impact, the flash of light, the feeling of being unmade and remade in the same instant. Sometimes the impossible just needs the right motivation. In his own recovery room, Rook sat up slowly, looking out at the purple nebula that had once seemed like poison, but now looked like hope again. On his bedside table sat a piece of the crystalline pod that had saved their lives, refracting light in patterns that reminded him of fusion fire. The final reports would call it a victory, a turning point in humanity's fight for survival. Scientists would study the hybrid pod for generations, learning new principles of physics from its impossible existence. Military strategists would analyze the battle, trying to replicate their success with proper weapons and chips. But for those who were there, it would always be remembered differently. Not as a battle or an experiment, but as proof that humanity's greatest weapon was never its technology or its weapons. It was the willingness to ride a nuclear fire into the heart of impossibility, armed with nothing but courage, desperation, and the kind of crazy ideas that come from having nothing left to lose. In the end, that had been enough. More than enough. The stars seemed brighter that night over Vega Colony, as if they too were celebrating humanity's survival. And somewhere in the purple nebula, fragments of the Firefly's plasma wake continued to burn, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful lights in the universe are the ones we make ourselves, even if we have to break all the rules to make them.